Happy Friday, and thanks for tuning in to RadioFreeRhinecliff.org. And this show in particular, correct me if I'm Norm, I'm your host, Norm. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Scott Martin Kosofsky. Did I say Kosofsky right?
Perfectly.
Beautiful. What's with a hyphenated first name? I've seen hyphenated surnames, but not so much a hyphenated first name.
This was the product of rabbinic wisdom of the 1950s.
Oh, boy.
I was an only child, and I am the youngest grandchild on both sides of the family. And my mother had wanted an opportunity to name a child after her father, and my father wanted an opportunity to name a child for his father. Now, of course, it was the Hebrew names that counted, and Shmuel, Samuel, and Moshe. My grandfather was called Maurice in the U.S. It was a thing of the early 20th century, I suppose. And the question was, all right, Shmuel, Moshe, who comes first? Who has first name rights? And became very controversial. And their
marriage survived, I hope.
Well, for a short while after.
Oh, God.
Well, they did for another, 18 years or something. And they waited till I left for college so that maybe I wouldn't notice that they were divorced. And they took this matter to their rabbi, and the rabbi decided that a hyphenation would be the thing. And the rest, I think, may have been decided by, an ancient method, which is coin toss. And so my mother's father came first. And, everyone was happy ever after. So I wound up, it was the fashion then to give alliterative names, first letters in common with the Hebrew name, at least phonetically. And so Shmuel, which is Samuel, became Scott, and Moses, became Martin. Nothing to do with each other, of course.
Right.
But that became the thing, and the hyphen was there, and that's that.
And it hardly seems especially Jewish, those names, Scott and Martin.
They're certainly not.
Like, not at all.
But this was the 50s,
And where was this wise rabbi located?
This was in Philadelphia.
Where you were born.
Where I was born and I grew up. I lived there till I was 17, and I went off to college after that and never lived there again. And I no longer, it's been many years since I've had any connection to Philadelphia. All of my old teachers and family, everyone is gone.
Did you have
moved away.
Did you have siblings?
No.
Oh, right. You said only child.
And it was, the last time I was there was maybe 10 years ago, just to take our kids there to visit. And, it's amazing how I remembered how to get from here to there, at least in downtown Philadelphia. And I knew my way around in the areas that I could get around at age 17.
Right.
Philadelphia's a very big place. There were neighborhoods that I never saw.
I love Philadelphia. I mean, I really enjoy it. I might love the W.C. Fields joke about it better. You know this joke?
Yes, of course.
Let's hear
it. Someone asked him, I don't know, it was something about the worst. There was the worst performance ever, and he's having a terrible time, or maybe wound up in jail, drunk or something. And he said, "Well, I'd rather be here than Philadelphia."
I was thinking of another one,
Tell me.
Which was he said, "I spent a week in Philadelphia one afternoon."
Oh yes, but that's said about a lot of places, and Philadelphia was. It's got a lot of charms, and it's got a lot of stuff, and it's okay. It's just one of the cities that grew too physically big for its own good. It had places to expand to, and so on. Boston, where I lived for 40 years, did not have that possibility except to annex several adjacent towns like Charlestown and Dorchester and so on, Roxbury, each of which had its own government once upon a time. And that became part of Boston. But to the west, it had nowhere to expand. Those were already established places like Brookline, say, or Cambridge.
And so at 17, you decamped from
I
Philadelphia and
went to
straight to Boston?
No, I went to Cornell.
Okay.
And I spent, 4.5 years there, or 4 years. Well, I also studied in Holland, and I had, so I was there I lived in Holland for long winter vacations, which were about 6 weeks, and then long summer vacations, which began in May and ended in August. I, could take exams early and stuff like that.
Why were you in Holland?
I was studying music there.
Oh, okay.
And my early life was in music entirely. I was a virtuoso recorder player. If you ever have heard of such a thing, there's such a thing.
I had never heard of such a thing.
And there is indeed. And the great master of this was a man named Frans Bruggen, who lived in Amsterdam and later became renowned as a conductor of his own orchestra called the Orchestra of the 18th Century. Frans died, I think, in 2014.
Wow.
And truly remarkable musician, just, a truly important person of the late 20th, early 21st centuries.
So you took up the recorder, I'm guessing, as many young school kids do.
No, actually not.
No.
In Philadelphia, the recorder was not known as a school instrument.
Huh.
One of the officials of the school music department had a financial interest in a company from Maryland that made little cross-blown flutes that they sold to every single student in the city of Philadelphia. And that is what took the place of the recorder. And it was a 6-hole fife with a mouthpiece.
Wow. So cross-blown like a flute is the
yes, that's right.
Cross,
but with a mouthpiece,
recorder you blow straight down.
Straight. But it had a little mouthpiece on this flute, so that the cross blowing didn't have to be controlled by trained muscles. All you had to do was blow. Just blow.
You know how to do that, don't you?
Yeah, right.
So these little fife-like things were like some manner of graft brought them into your school.
Yes, that's
district.
exactly
and
right.
Everybody got one.
Yeah,
and the people got rich.
Yes, yeah.
And was it widely known that the school administration was on the take from this fife manufacturer?
It would have come as no surprise to anyone. This was, I think, fairly standard behavior. My father was a financial journalist and wrote for what was then called the Wall Street Journal Syndicate. He would do research and development articles, and some would appear, many would appear in the Wall Street Journal, but then they would appear in other publications from the Wall Street Journal. That was the byline.
Right.
And my father was one of the people who wrote those things. And so, he always came home with incredible stories of graft and corruption. And to top it off, my father's cousin, once removed, was a congressman from one of the districts in Philadelphia. And my mother was involved with his campaign management for many years, and knew, of course, all of the politicians of the city of Philadelphia. And it was the kind of thing that when I started to drive at age 16, I could park on the sidewalk at City Hall and no one would say anything. And I became the beneficiary of this, outrageous kind of abuse and corruption. And, my mother would say, just please try to not do that, And I said, but Ma, you said it's okay. And it was a funny thing. So anyway, someone getting rich on selling flutes, at least there were goods in the transaction.
So at some point, how old were you when you got your first hot flute?
I was, I think, 10. Now, I had played the trumpet for several years before then.
Okay.
And continued to play. And I studied with 2 members of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I was pretty good, but it wasn't really my interest. The recorder was something, and the historical aspect of it in 17th and 18th century music that I was interested in. This was heaven to me. And but I played the trumpet to be sociable. It was a thing to play in the orchestra and so on. And,
Right.
I think I made it to like a national youth symphony that.
On the trumpet.
Yeah. And,
Nice.
Leopold Stokowski came and conducted for a few hours. And,
Leopold.
Yes, and that was a real great honor. It really was an honor.
Yeah, I'll bet.
And he was really, he was really marvelous.
Yeah. Did you ever see the Bugs Bunny where Bugs Bunny plays Leopold?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So you play in the trumpet, but you were taking up this
the recorder, and I found a
crossblown-
teacher who was a Dutch organist who was actually a linguist by profession, but he taught organ and recorder at in Philadelphia, and he recommended that I study with the top American player, a guy named Bernard Cranis, who lived in New York City. And so I studied with him for a number of years. It was a great friend. And and later when Bernie had moved to Great Barrington permanently, I went to a summer arts camp in Stockbridge called Indian Hill, which is kind of a legend. That's been fostered. The legend has been fostered by a number of it figures in a number of important memoirs from kids who had passed through there and grew up to do something later.
Right.
And Frank Rich most extensively actually talks about it in one memoir. And but there are a number of others. Meg Wolitzer wrote a novel based on her experience there. I didn't know her. She was after me.
Right.
And I forgot the name of it. I would say it if I knew it. And it's and that was that. So I went to Cornell because the then head of the music department was a viola da gamba player who had performed.
What is a viola da gamba?
The viola da gamba, the viols, is a family of instruments like the violin family.
Okay.
They're bowed instruments and they're played on the on the legs. They're held like
so
a
it's
cello,
like a
kind of like a cello,
regular viola,
but in various sizes, and they usually have anywhere between 5 and 7 strings, most often 6.
Right.
And the necks are fretted like a guitar.
Right.
And but those were they existed in parallel. They were the refined instruments at a time when the violin family was more of a street instrument. But that all, then they coexisted for a while. The violin family was capable of being much louder.
Right.
And that was, a factor in the decline of the viol, like the decline of the recorder. And larger spaces and loudness became
right.
a
So
factor.
You said it sounds like you sort of described a viola. What is the da gamba part?
Gamba is legs, so it's the viol of the legs as opposed to the viola da braccio, which is the arm.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. So sorry to go back, when you finally landed on the recorder,
yes,
did you feel like you'd found the place you were destined to be, or?
Yeah. I mean, this was the voice. I fell in love with the voice of it, and it was. I think it was as close as I felt I could come to singing, which if I could do, I would have done. And
that's just kind of gorgeous.
Yes, I know. It's really amazing. You can study voice and you can become okay.
Right.
But to be really good, you're either born with it or you're not. And I have a daughter who was born with it.
Right.
And who's really utterly marvelous. And it gives me no amount of pleasure that just limitless pleasure that she was born with this gift.
And so who do you like to listen to? What singers do you just think, oh, if I could sing like them?
Oh, heavens. Well,
all right, let me ask you this
depends. It may depend on my gender affect of the moment. It's funny that as a good listener, and I'm a very good listener, it's not, I don't just identify with male voices because I have a male voice.
Right.
But, it's female voices too. I have the luxury of, in my mind, being any singer I would like.
Sure.
But the range is incredible because, it goes anywhere from, all of the great leader German song singers to all of the great opera singers that we know from recordings, starting with Caruso, of course, but all, to Aretha, who doesn't want to be that? And it's there's no limit to it. They're great singers in every kind of music. I mean, and some of them are great almost all of the time.
Right.
Which is even more amazing.
I would always pick Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh, yeah. I think I would pick, I love Ella, but if I had to pick, it would probably be Sarah Vaughan.
Oh.
Yeah. It would really have to be.
Yeah. And what do you think she has for you over Ella?
Well, to say over is almost sacrilegious. You don't do that.
Well,
what it is a she's willing to go in more dangerous jazz directions.
Interesting.
Because her career was not quite on the public level that Ella's was, governed by record labels to an extent. She was treated more as just a jazz musician.
Right.
And she had not become quite the public figure. Not to say that she wasn't, but not quite on the level of Ella.
Right.
And
interesting.
There's I find there's very little to find fault with either. The world is big enough to accommodate both of them, and a whole lot of both of them.
Unless my question is the hypothetical genie giving you only one wish, and the world's not big enough.
Get a new genie.
Yeah, well, hopefully a new genie will come by. So you go away to Cornell.
Yes.
And you're, in the meantime, while you're there, you're taking off for Holland.
Yeah.
And you're studying. Now, there's an album. You put out an album of Von Eyck.
Yeah, when I was...
was he Dutch?
Yeah. I put out a few recordings when I was like 19 and 20. Back when putting out recordings actually meant someone had faith in you. You couldn't do this yourself. And, I made a number of recordings. And... I think the last one that came out, I must have been about, 24, 25. However, all the while, there was another thing lurking in my life in a big, big way, which is that I began my musical interests were often well beyond the recorder. And that as much as I love the recorder, my musical interests were really much more wide-ranging than I can do with the recorder. And in high school, I found myself with a hobby. In the high school I attended, there was an unused print shop. It used to be part of the shop curriculum that kids have to involve themselves in, like the home ec curriculum for girls. And there behind the electric shop was this whole print shop, and it was not in use. And I found out that the electric shop teacher was in charge. He had taught printing previously, and I was really interested in printing because the father of a friend of mine was the chief of the press room at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And his father was an old Jewish printer in South Philadelphia who still had a shop when I was a little kid, a little job shop. And he set Yiddish and set English, of course, and so on. And
So when you say set, what is that?
Typeset, metal type from cases in a composing stick, letter by letter. That's the way it was done.
Tell me, how does that work?
Well, how does it work? Metal letters, individual letters of every letter in the alphabet, uppercase, lowercase, figures, punctuation.
What does that mean, figures?
Figures, numbers.
Okay.
These are all carved into in each size in the end of bars of steel that's been hard steel that's been annealed so you could carve into it. Then it gets hardened.
What does that mean, annealed?
Annealed is softening.
Okay.
And then it gets hardened with ice and so on. And then the end of that steel bar is tapped into a small blank slip of copper. And the thing in which the letter is carved and punched in is called a punch. To be a punch cutter was an exceeding high skill thing. And then the tapping of that into this brass strip, this copper brass strip, it's an alloy, and had to be finished so that it had to be all kind of leveled off. And that was work, and the size of this thing, that thing is called a matrix, by the way. The finishing of that, all of that was done by someone called a justifier. That was incredible high skill work, in its own way as difficult as cutting punches, and as critical, because the space between each letter that interacts, the space that's on either side of a letter interacts with the space on either side of every other letter, making a kind of, 52 chess games being played at once in order to get them to fit right. And anyway, from this matrix gets put into a mold, and into the mold was poured in an alloy that's primarily lead, but with a bit of tin and a bit of antimony as hardener. And then it's cast. The letter is then polished. It's finished off. There's an end to be broken off and finished. And then each letter is put in a case, letter after letter after letter after letter. And then someone holding what looks like, how can I describe a composing stick? It's a kind of ruler device with ends. It looks like a little like the kind of device that is always been used to measure shoes, your feet for shoes. It has an element of that in it. And you place backward and upside down every letter, one after another. Then is a strip of lead. That's why we call leading, is the space between the lines. And then you start the next line, and so on. And that gets, when the stick is filled up, it gets carefully moved into a form, and you just keep on composing till you're finished doing the composition. And that's how type was set from roughly 1450 to well into the 20th century.
It sounds incredibly labor intensive.
Incredibly labor intensive, and so labor intensive that Mark Twain, who had done that kind of work much of earlier in his life, thought it was the most grueling thing but yet the most important thing in the whole world. And when a guy came forward with a mechanical way of setting type, he invested everything in this. It was the Page typesetting machine. It was this huge monstrosity, and it never was able to compose more type than could go in a small booklet. And two of them were made. One of them is in the Mark Twain house in Hartford, and the other was lost in a scrap drive during World War II.
Wait, so Twain invested everything in this?
Everything, yeah.
And it didn't take?
The house in Hartford, he lost the house in Hartford because of his investment with Mr. Page and his typesetting machine. And the house that is the Mark Twain House Museum today. And anyway, I found all of this terribly interesting, and I became a private pupil of the electric shop teacher to learn how to do this stuff. And I just loved it. And at Cornell, I became very friendly with an art history professor, a remarkable man named Peter Kahn, whose brother Wolf Kahn is a very famous painter. Yeah. And Peter had been involved with graphic arts and printing and so on. He was a calligrapher himself. And he had done this for a good number of years. And he taught for a while at Pratt Institute. And also having someone who taught at Pratt Institute was an American printer named Joseph Blumenthal, who had a very small, very, very refined and lovely press called the Spiral Press. And he would visit at Cornell regularly because he had a little weekend house in Trumansburg, also on Cayuga Lake on the western shore, I think it is, and yeah, it is, and he would come and visit there from time to time and visit with Peter and his family, and I met him then, and he was working on this book, an exhibition for the Morgan Library called The Art of the Printed Book, 1450 to 1950 or something like that, and he was very interested in music type. Music was set by type once upon a time from the early in the 16th century to kind of the end of the 18th century, but it was overtaken by engraving, which has a lot more possibilities. But anyway, because some important printers were involved with music type, Joe was very interested in learning about it, and he didn't know anything about music. And he thought I was the perfect person to research this for him in case there was anything worth mentioning in this book. I think one name gets mentioned in the book. But nevertheless, it got me on a research tour, you might say, of this, and I felt like I was part of it. And even when I was a student in Holland, I got to know that I visited a number of times at this great famous type foundry in the city of Haarlem, and where they continued casting metal type letter at a time because they could afford to do it, because they had another business. The other business was printing money for about 40% of planet Earth.
Wow.
And yes, and they still do this work, and it's a money-making business. Yeah. So anyway, I became I just was more and more involved. And then in 1975, I moved to Boston permanently. That is until I moved to Rhinebeck 40 years later.
Okay.
And
let me back up. You graduated.
Yeah.
You had a degree in music.
Yes, eventually music and European history. Yeah.
In European history. Yeah. But all the time you were still fascinated with type.
All the time. And I'm performing, I'm traveling, I'm giving tours. I toured in many times throughout parts of South America and in Africa and South Africa and what was then Rhodesia.
This is the recorder prodigy.
Yeah, exactly. And I was giving concerts in Europe and in the U.S. But my heart was really drifted to this other thing. And then I started...
The other thing being type.
Type, yeah, and printing. Right. So when I moved to Boston in 1975, I visited a man who was then in his 80s named T.J. Lyons, Thomas J. Lyons, who was the last of the what we call jobbing printers, people who could do all kinds of things and so on. He was also one of the two greatest collectors of American antique type in the country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And even then, people would come from the Smithsonian, like almost, it seemed, monthly to try to get him to sign on to sell his collection, which he did not and would not do. And
is he still here?
Oh, no. He died in 1986.
And what happened to the collection?
Well, I'll tell you, but he died in 1986 at the age of 94, having had a stroke while walking to work. So, he had a bad last day, but it was really great until then. And it was the collection finally got sold to an airline pilot who was a collector and fanatic about this stuff. And he later donated all of it to an organization. It now resides in the Museum of Printing in Haverhill, Massachusetts.
Sounds like a good...
It is. I guess, they've always had problems with money. If anyone wants to support a good cause, I recommend them. And just museumofprinting.org, it's worthy.
Right.
It's but that I've inherited little tiny pieces of that collection that I still keep in little boxes, though I donated my letterpress shop. Oh yes, I should preface that by saying that when I moved to Boston in 1975 and became friends of T.J. Lyons, I it came to my attention that all of this old metal type was being sold off for the price of scrap, the price of the alloys and scrap metal, even presses and everything. So in my South End apartment that I was renting for, the duplex that I was renting in the South End for, I don't know, the grand sum of maybe $285 a month, and I filled up the living room with workbanks and cases of type and so on, and then in the dining room was taken over by a Vandercook proof press, a hand press, and that's and I was happily on my way, and eventually the work got pretty good, and music groups started hiring me to do stuff, and the recording company that I'd made records for hired me to design things. And the next thing I knew, I was really ensconced in design and type as type, and then came rare book dealers and all various people and so on.
And so it sounds like maybe there wasn't sort of a decision to leave the recorder behind. It was just you followed your heart to this other place.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that really one of the things that I got involved with in Boston was with my then wife and two very dear friends who were musical instrument makers. We started a thing called the Boston Early Music Festival, and we started talking about it in 1980, and then it became the first festival in 1981, and it was a thing that became famous overnight by a kind of stroke of fate, which was that the Boston Globe's music critic of the time had been very interested in what we were doing because it was really ambitious, because Boston had become the center of this kind of musical activity, and there had been every year a meeting of the Music Critics Association. All the music critics in the newspapers, classical music critics, jazz critics, they'd all meet in one place. And that was the Globe Critics' year to plan the thing in Boston. And it coincided with the Boston Early Music Festival. So every day there were dispatches to the papers everywhere in the country and around the world, and the Times in London said this is the world's foremost festival of early music, and the then second critic from the New Yorker, now Sir Nicholas Kenyon, came and covered the whole thing, and one thing after another, it really established itself, and that took up a great deal of my music space, and I was designing and typesetting really elaborate material for the festival. Right. So, and I didn't want to get involved with, I realized that in the early music world, being, I eventually became the president of the thing for a period, and it gave me a kind of political influence that I didn't want to abuse. So I thought suddenly people were asking me to do more concerts, and I realized they wanted something in return. So I started saying, "Oh, gee, thanks, but no, I don't think so." And that was the thing that really moved me out of music performance.
Right.
It took up that space, and that's okay. He lived happily ever after.
Right.
The graphic arts work, the book work that what I was dreaming of, were doing these great volumes of, Talmudic work, work in which there's text around text around text.
And that's what you were dreaming of before you'd even started doing.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I was. Yeah. I was dreaming of managing great bunches of information, because unlike the recorder, quite the opposite.
Managing typographically, and design-wise.
Unlike the recorder, which has a marvelous but exceedingly limited repertory of stuff, books are about everything. Right. It's utterly everything. And I could have gone in any direction I wished, and I could go do a book about this or a book about that, but something happened in the 80s that in the mid 80s that led the way to my becoming a major producer of Judaic work. and it all started with a Christmas songbook.
Okay.
You know.
Let me back up. Were you raised religious?
I was raised in religion. I attended Hebrew school for 7 years, 6.5, 7 years, and 3 day, 10-hour a week Hebrew school. My family was very, my older relatives around whom I was raised had very thorough religious backgrounds, but they led secular lives. Though at home they followed all of the major and even minor observances, and so on. But that was not such a big thing in my own household. It had become a bit diluted, but I had a great awareness of it and a certain fondness for it that was as much intellectual as it was anything else. But I grew it. I always had a great interest in it, but I was not leading a religious life by any stretch.
Okay. So when you first saw sort of like Hebrew typeset in a book or something, when did that happen that you thought, oh, that is so gorgeous, I'm going to start dreaming of doing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had seen through encyclopedias, and I'd seen modern editions of the Talmud, and that are mostly based on a 19th century Talmud from Vilna, which is now Vilnius in Lithuania, from a printing house there. And I was fascinated by the elaborate nature of it, in which a central column of text was surrounded by another column of text, which was on the other side surrounded by yet another column of text. And that, it's funny, in the rather early in the personal computer era, people spoke of hypertext, as this big thing.
Right.
Well, listen, Buster, there were hypertexts in the 16th century, and they had the good sense to leave the chaff on the cutting room floor. And so this was. It was an interesting thing. There was also that very idea of the chaff on the cutting room floor was for me a way of thinking of being involved. Is also, I found myself getting more and more involved on the editorial end as well as the design and typography end, and one thing after another. I there's no aspect of printing that I haven't been involved with, because no one told me that I shouldn't or couldn't, because I didn't have the weight of a proper schooling sitting on me. I was started as an amateur, so I could go in any direction I pleased and be as thorough as I wanted to be.
I mean, people think of Cornell as kind of like being proper schooling.
Yeah, it was not. It didn't work for me terribly well.
Okay.
Although that's I shouldn't say that it was not
altogether
altogether
free
true.
from the constraints of whatever they're teaching.
I didn't get on with those kinds of constraints, but I was able to use it.
Right.
It's a very interesting thing. I was an extremely good student, but not in the way that they would have wanted me to be.
They being largely your folks and your teachers and stuff.
No. The structure of the university and that sort of thing.
I see.
I got to do what I wanted. It was all right. One shouldn't complain.
Right.
But the fact is that it's. I didn't like people saying, "Well, you can't do that because it's outside your major and blah blah blah."
Right.
That sort of, because they had a culinary program in the hotel management school, and that I would sit in on whenever I wanted. I always tell people I was the kind of student who walked out of a medieval history final halfway, thinking I must at least be able to get a D, and to go to Pierre Frenet's lecture on omelets at the hotel school, which, by the way, what I don't remember about the Albigensian heresy has never hurt me. But what I know about omelets has been a tremendous benefit for the
Opened
rest
a lot of doors,
life.
has it?
Yeah.
And do you like to cook?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love to ask this question. If you had somebody coming over for dinner, say, who you really wanted to impress, what dish would you make?
Oh, for God's sake!
No dietary restrictions.
Yes. I don't. My wife Betsy Sarles, also a designer, a wonderful designer. We're both extremely good cooks. She has the gift of being and the discipline to be a superb baker, and you can find her stuff at Samuel's on Monday mornings. And let's see. We're very diverse cooks. I mean, to ask me about a favorite is like asking about
not a favorite
book or a favorite
the
piece
most
of music.
show-offy. The thing, somebody's coming over, you really want to impress them.
Okay, the most impressive, something that always impresses, is I make a couple of times a year, and friends will flock to this dinner of making a thing called...
I'm free that night.
Called pâté tortoise style. It's a Hungarian dish. It's not a pâté at all. It is a mixture of ground pork, triple smoked bacon, rice, and layers of cabbage and lots of marjoram, and it's layered like a lasagna in a pot it's like a cabbage lasagna. It's one of the great stuffed cabbages of the planet. There are many of them, but this is the grandest one of all. And it's cooked in this thing, and it's turned out, and you got this big huge oval cake of things you slice like a birthday cake,
right?
And it's comes with a sauce that's of course sour cream and paprika and drippings and so on. And it's not very kosher, I should say, but it is.
I think if they triple smoke the bacon, it's okay.
I think
I'm
so.
rusty
too.
on.
I think so too. But it's funny. A rabbi once stopped by my office unannounced and came in to ask me some question about some philological matter of Hebrew that he thought I would know the answer to. And on my screen, I had just gotten a promo email from La Tienda, the dealer in Spanish hams and all of that. And here was this beautiful picture of this, jamón de bolota on the screen. And I said, take a look at this. This is this you should know. This is also God's work.
Yeah.
And that he says, is it really that good? I said, yeah, I'm afraid so.
That's so funny.
There are jokes about that, but I'll leave it be.
Okay. Well, thanks for the digression. You were starting to tell about a Christmas Revels book and how that changed your...
Yeah. The Christmas Revels is this wonderful theatrical organization that was started by a wonderful performer and educator named John Langstaff, who had first produced this show in New York City as an NBC Christmas special. A 2-hour NBC Christmas special in the early 50s. And his daughter had remembered it for the rest of, ever after. I think she was a child in it. And by the early 70s, she encouraged her dad to revive the show. And he did at Harvard Sanders Theater. They did this theatrical, and it was sold out in an instant. And then the next year, there were 6 performances. The next year, 10 performances. As many days as there were between Thanksgiving and New Year, they were doing the show, which was, this kind of old English pagan Christmas thing was the basis of it, with a lot of other traditions brought to bear upon this stuff. And he did a beautiful and elaborate songbook that I produced for the Revels, and in which I decorated with a lot of 16th and 16th century, largely woodcuts, and so on. And it was beautiful, and it had real music arrangements, some of which were not dumbed down, some of which were simple. And the thing was, it's still in print to this day.
Where did you find the woodcuts?
Oh, I'd always been a collector of, early printing stuff. My interest in early printing led me to know exactly where to ferret out all of the stuff. I was really a collector of the stuff.
Right.
And so that, that book came to the notice of people at Harvard Hillel who had planned to produce a very elaborate Shabbat songbook in memory of a young woman who had been killed in a car accident, and who had been a member at Harvard Hillel, and whose parents were involved with the university, and they they fought about it for years and so on. And anyway, I was hired to do it because of this sort of internecine battles at that moment at Harvard Hillel. I was kind of left on my own. And that was a weird place to be because the rabbi at Harvard Hillel was then retiring. He provided me with the liturgical stuff that he wanted. And then I was given a list of songs. But so I and a group of my friends who were very involved with either Jewish music or rare Jewish music or, just music, I organized all these people with whom to do really wonderful arrangements of these songs for piano, violin, 4 voices, 2 voices, voice and percussion. It was, the last gasps of a world in which a whole lot of people had a modicum of musical ability, that a lot of people still played the piano or something.
Right.
And they could do this. And the book became, within a month or so, there were reviews describing it as a classic for the ages and so on. And so I'm thinking, oh my God, this is, it was a bizarre project in that I was so left on my own.
Right.
And
did this happen around the same time as the music festival? That
the music
immediately phenomenal.
All of these things were going on kind of simultaneously.
Must have been feeling pretty fly.
Well, by 1989, I think I got out of the festival, and I was working on this songbook pretty seriously then. And I'd retired from the festival, I think in 1989, and passed it on to people some of whom are there to this day running it, and have received, like Légion d'honneur and stuff like that for their work, and which makes me very proud, actually.
Right.
So this book came out, and suddenly I was really deluged with requests. Deluge. For me, a deluge is 3 projects.
Yeah.
But at the same, but some of them were really important and worthwhile, and I thought, oh, I love this. This is wonderful, and I just became more and more involved. Now, for the Hillel Songbook, I made a display. There was no good Hebrew typesetting available in those at that moment, and the Harvard Department of Near Eastern and Semitic Studies had a really kludgy photo typesetting system that did some Hebrew. It was horrible, but it worked. Kind of.
So this is the typesetting that you described. Every individual letter.
Oh no! This was early electronic photo typesetting, which was a bit of a misery. But for the titles, I made a font. I drew it based on a late medieval German hand, Ashkenazic hand.
Okay.
And so on. And I made it as a font, and then at just around that moment came the democratization of digital font making technology.
Let me ask: is you specified it's an Ashkenazic hand of that font of Hebrew?
Yeah,
is the Sephardic hand different?
Yes, it is, and it's interesting that most of the types that one reads in text are Sephardic in their origin. And because they're sleeker, simpler forms, whereas the Ashkenazic hand, which almost vanished, is spikier and so on. Let me give you an idea of the difference. Think of German Gothic letters, pointy and spiky. That is what the Ashkenazic hand looked like.
Okay.
In the Gothic period in the German-speaking world was the Gothic period in the Hebrew-speaking world. Why? Well, visual styles migrate. They wherever the food you eat, the things you visualize, the colors you can mix. It depends on geography. It depends on the local influences. So typography is also absorbent, the way food and music are absorbent of whatever is around it, but it's also a difference of tools. It's a metal stylus is used to make Gothic letters.
Right.
A reed pen was used to write the Sephardic ones.
Okay.
Think Mediterranean, think Germany.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the letters are the same,
quill.
but sort of the visual accent, if you will,
Yes,
is different.
That's right.
That's
right.
so interesting.
Yeah. That's right. These are really these are differences that I don't know, they mean something to people even when they don't know exactly what these differences are. And that's true about type design in general, is that they have such a strong subliminal influence over not only physical readability but of mood and so on. They're really able to transmit that kind of information to people who recognize that there are differences, but they're not able to identify exactly what those differences are.
Right. All right. I'm going to ask you another desert island question.
Yeah.
Desert island, you only get one font.
Yeah.
What font are you choosing?
I think that it would have to be something based on what I would call the second or third generation French Renaissance type founders, and one of them, whose work I know very well, was a man who was Flemish named Hendrik van den Kere, and his work does survive. He's after the generation of Claude Garamond and Grandjean, or just Robert Grandjean, I'd say. Anything based on Grandjean, mid 16th century type founder, and whose work survives in plenty. And you read every day, all of you, everyone listening, will read some stuff that is based on, sometimes slavishly based on Grandjean, and you don't even know it. You have no idea how much your reading habits have basically not changed since much of the 16th century. And you don't realize that even the Helvetica that you think is so modern and so on is a ripoff of a late 19th century font that's a little bit better.
Right.
And it's a, these things, they're very deeply embedded parts of the culture.
Right.
It's not a good place for, they're little opportunities to do cute things that are, quote, new, but they don't have any, they're not for reading.
Right.
I'm interested in reading.
Right. So this font you described, is it, if I wanted to look it up, would I look for Garamond?
No, look for Robert Grandjean, Granjon.
Okay.
Robert Grandjean.
Okay.
You could look up Claude Garamond too, but Grandjean is a little more to the point.
Okay. And there's a font called Hebrew Garamond.
No.
Yeah,
but that's just a trash hanger-on to some.
It was on my Word document.
Well, there you go. And yes, no, like there's a Hebrew Times Roman. It's not really Times. Yeah, never mind. Yeah.
So you've designed some fonts.
I have. All the Hebrew fonts I use were made by me because I need things that work correctly. And every couple of years, when Microsoft does a major new operating system, they promise they're going to clean up the Hebrew, the Hebrews that they offer, because they don't really work with all the diacritics. And every couple of years,
diacritics being
all the little accents and so on. Biblical Hebrew has this incredibly elaborate system of accents. There are these vowels that are give the Hebrew does not have natural vowels. It has a couple of letters that are vowel impliers, but and then it has this for the cantillation for this. The Bible is meant to be chanted, sung,
right.
And so the note patterns are captured in these little markings, of which there are, some 30 of them. And it's a very elaborate typographic system. And to get it right in digital type is extremely difficult. It was extremely difficult in metal type too, and it was never perfect. But in the digital world, we can make it scribally perfectly accurate. And I needed to do that, so I did.
So when you look back at that font that you made scribally perfect, and you use it from time to time, I'm guessing.
Still, yeah, very much so.
Are you happy?
Oh yeah,
Do you ever go back and just change something a little bit?
Well, it's interesting that font was used first in the conservative Machzor, which is the books used, the very large prayer book used for the high holy days, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it's nearly 1,000 pages.
Wow!
And it's I made the first version of this font for that, and everyone loved it. And then when we came to do the Sabbath book, another 1,000 pages, the Sabbath and other holidays book,
right?
I revised the font considerably. Not that many people knew. You could see, it's kind of invisible, in a way, but boy, it means a lot to me.
That's so sweet.
Because in the middle, in between those two things, I had an epiphany about how to simplify the data set for doing all of this. It was like a light went on. And what was the idea based on? It was based on looking at all of those punches and matrices at the Plantin Moretus Museum in Antwerp, where all of this great original material is kept.
Wow. All right, listen, we got like 2 minutes left. It's flown by. I really want to talk about the Book of Customs.
Oh, yeah.
The Complete Handbook for the Jewish Year. That sounds like an amazing feat.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. It's my only book as a solo book as an author. I've contributed articles to things and other books and journals and such, but and I like writing. And this was a book that came about because of my research for the Harvard Hillel Songbook. When I was looking for these woodcuts that would be Jewish in some way, I was told by experts in this that there was no such thing, and then I found that was completely and utterly untrue. There were these books that were printed starting in Venice in the very end of the 16th century, that were these Yiddish handbooks for the Jewish year that went through month by month, through the holidays, through Sabbath, all of the important life events. And each one had a little woodcut, and it had also for the zodiac, it had for the months, zodiac woodcuts. And this book went through, probably 60 known editions in various parts of Europe. There are even Judeo-Spanish editions of it, and so on. And as I used all of these woodcuts in the Harvard Songbook, I thought maybe I better learn something about the book it came from.
Right.
And I did.
Is it what it sounds like, a complete handbook for the Jewish year?
Yeah, and I don't, it's not a translation of the original. It's what it is I use the original form and then use the original words as a kind of color commentary.
Well, where can I see this? Is it in the
it's
local
published
library?
by HarperCollins.
Oh, nice.
And it's no longer in print except as an ebook. It came out in 2004.
I'll see if I can track it down.
I withdrew it, actually, because I wanted to do another edition, which I haven't done. I may never do.
Oh, geez. I set a timer. I don't always do that. We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Scott Martin
Yeah,
Kosofsky.
I could have said something worthwhile if I should have watched the clock.
Thank you so much for being here. What a treat talking with you. We could fill up like a whole day's worth of
I'm
this
sorry.
talk.
I'm just gabbing away.
Everybody, thanks for tuning in and listening. Have a fabulous Friday and a great weekend.
Yeah.
And Scott Martin, thanks again for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you, Norm.
Good night.